Hey everybody, wherever and whenever you're watching from, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today we're back in Girls Frontline 2 with part 3 of the basic guide on boss fight. Upon reaching tier 8 of boss fight, we now face Deichgraf's final form. Deichgraf's second form is now phase 1. Just like before, our rating depends on the combined score for both phases. In this guide, I'll be giving you a general game plan to challenge Deichgraf using any team within a manageable level deficit for tier 8. To avoid confusion, I'll be referring to tier 8's phase 1 as Deichgraf 2 since it's Deichgraf's second form, and tier 8's phase 2 as Deichgraf 3. We'll be making a few references to the earlier tiers, and so we'll be calling the first form as Deichgraf 1. The first encounter is against Deichgraf 2 and is largely the same as tier 6 and 7 with only two significant changes. First, the pool of objectives for the Frontline arena includes the following: cause a stability break from tier 6, fully heal the diner gate from tier 7, and it adds its own eliminate 2 enemies. Take note that the enemies for the elimination objective are the bell fleas, which explode upon taking even a single point of damage. They have an explosion radius of 3 tiles and do not inflict friendly fire or destroy cover. The recommendation for using any Vanguard from Guide 2 still applies, but just be very careful if you're using Krolik or Ulrid since a direct approach is going to hurt. Non-Vanguards are still usable as long as you maximize their movement, keeping in mind the 3-turn limit for evac. Second, just like tier 6 and 7, buffs that your team and Deichgraf can gain in this first fight will carry over to the next fight. Every stack of power boost it gains when you leave your dolls beside the retrieved armors will carry over to Deichgraf 3 unless you kill Deichgraf 2, so make sure to track the turns that Deichgraf will use scrap recycling and move away from the armors on the field. On the other hand, every armor refill you get from completing the frontline objectives will carry over to your second team as well. Since you want to complete the objectives anyway to avoid ultimatum's damage, you should be getting your defense increase in the next fight. Deichgraf 3 has a combination of skills from Deichgraf 1 and 2 that are more powerful than before. You can pause here to read through them or check them in-game. Graf's Discipline 3 is an amped-up combination of Wrath and Whiplash from Deichgraf 1. It now targets the closest unit, just like Wrath, but puts a lava pool if you don't meet the stability threshold, just like Whiplash. This lava pool is permanent, so as much as possible do not let anyone with low stability take this hit. The most important bit here is the new debuff. Discipline Mark lasts for 2 turns, and if it reaches 2 stacks, that doll takes Deichgraf's max HP as damage. For reference, Deichgraf 3's HP is around 66,000. Cross Prison 3 is again an amped up combination of Deichgraf 1 and 2. Just like Deichgraf 1, there is no stopping this attack the same way you would in Deichgraf 2's fight by reducing its movement to 0. Just like Deichgraf 2, after it uses this attack it gains a lot of buffs: a 40% defense increase, 30% damage reduction, 20% attack increase, and a 30% damage amp. Since we can't prevent Deichgraf 3 from activating this like we can with Deichgraf 2, we can only avoid the attack, which is now 5 tiles wide instead of 3. From there, how you deal with the buffs will depend on who you can bring. If you can afford to bring a doll with Cleanse, then this is the situation in which they will be very useful. If you can't bring a doll with Cleanse, then this becomes either a stat check or a situation where you're better off dealing with the other enemies on the field. Command 2 makes a return and is now 5 tiles wide as well. Just like before, letting it hit a standard armor gives Deichgraf a 10% damage amp, plus 1 stability damage and 20% damage reduction. Unlike Deichgraf 1, we don't have any Goliaths that we can rely on, so we will have to body block this attack once again. Hunt Patrol 2 makes a return as well, but is now under our control. Instead of targeting random dolls, it targets the furthest doll. Take note that the armor drop is not a standard armor. It can be hit by Command 2 with no problem, and we can also attack and deal damage to it. Just like the standard armor, it behaves as another piece of cover. However, the secret armor will deal damage around it every turn and also applies a random debuff every turn. There will be situations where we need to be behind it and times when we want to be away from it. Scrap Recovery 2 retrieves all the armors on the field, but no longer gives Deichgraf a buff for each one. We still want to be away from the armors when they are retrieved, so we avoid every bit of damage that we can. Lastly, Judgment is the main gimmick of this fight. Deichgraf marks every tile that isn't behind cover, like the armors, and nukes the entire area on the next turn for 66,000 damage. Given all of that, our game plan is looking very similar to Deichgraf 1 with some adjustments. We want to juggle the damage across the team so that no one character gets 2 hits of discipline and eats a fat 66k. We want to body block for the standard armors to prevent Deichgraf from getting even stronger, even going so far as to body blocking with multiple characters so that one character isn't eating all 5 lines worth of missiles. And we want to dance around the armors on the field, using them as cover only when needed and moving away from them at the right times. Sticking to this game plan should allow you to reach or get close to an outstanding clear as cleanly as possible with any team that makes sense within a 2 to 5 level deficit. If you're running particularly strong characters, then you can probably push for an even greater level difference, but your mileage may vary. Since this is the last tier for standard boss fight, and also possibly the hardest challenge we will face so far, let's talk about some preparations and optimizations we can do. Deichgraf 3's weakness are light and heavy ammo and shock and corrosive damage. If your team allows for it, ideally you would want to run characters using the same ammo and phase damage types. Nemesis, once again, is a reasonable option here since everyone has her, but is not necessary if you have alternatives. As I mentioned earlier, Cross Prison gives Deichgraf 3 a collection of chunky buffs. Since we can't stop it from activating like Deichgraf 2, running a character that cleanses buffs is a consideration and an optimization we should be thinking about if we can. As of recording, characters that can cleanse include Vepli and Peritia. You might have used Vepli in Deichgraf 2, which means Peritia would be your only option, but she's a decent option since she also has heavy ammo and corrosive damage, though she's a bit AoE focused. Speaking of AoE, characters who benefit from hitting multiple targets at a time can be used here as well, since both standard and secret armors count as targets hit for AoE attacks. So characters like Lotta, for example, will still find use here if you choose to bring them. Since we are juggling damage across our team even more now compared to earlier fights, characters that provide the shelter buff are very useful, especially if we want to avoid being in the 6 stability range for Discipline's permanent lava pools. Make sure to check your supports if they can provide shelter on their skills, or if you have the space for them, bring Groza or Sabrina. Like majority of the bosses in the game, Deichgraf compensates for not benefiting from cover by gaining damage reduction per point of stability, so if you can, save your high damage bursts on stability break. Just like the previous tiers, you can take a break between each fight to swap weapons, attachments, and keys around to your next team, or even try to sneak in a bit of grinding. Also remember that boss fight is weekly, so it's best to attempt at the end of the week when your team is at its strongest. Don't forget to use your backtracks, and if you do run out of backtracks, you can reset the second fight without it consuming an attempt. You can also choose to reset the entire fight if you feel like you can kill Deichgraf 2 and get enough points from Deichgraf 3. Deichgraf 2 has 51,000 HP, and the threshold for outstanding is 96,300. So, you can choose to either kill Deichgraf 2 and get 45,300 points from Deichgraf 3, or get around 30,000 from Deichgraf 2 and kill Deichgraf 3 depending on how you feel about the teams you have. Since this is the last tier, there's less pressure on trying to get outstanding right away. Instead, it's best to approach each attempt as a limit test to see how far your team can get until you reach outstanding. That's it for the game plan and tips. Usually, I would end this with a demo, but I can't for a couple reasons. First, Deichgraf 3 is a bit harder to demo because the fight will look very different for each team turn by turn, compared to Deichgraf 1 and 2. Second, my own team at the time of recording is actually quite underleveled and under-equipped for this fight, far beyond the 5-level deficit I mentioned earlier. I know for a fact that there is no situation for my own team to be able to challenge this right now, and the resources I would need to spend to either raise them or raise stronger characters to challenge it are far beyond my means. In case you haven't noticed, I'm not whaling, so rather than add in my own attempt, I think we can end it here. Hopefully, you find this helpful for your own runs. Good luck, and we'll meet again when we're all level 50 for Crossroad Challenge. Wherever and whenever you're watching from, have a good day or good night, take care, and thanks for watching.